NATO at a critical crossroads. At its summit in Chicago, this military alliance decided many things in principle, like ending the occupation of Afghanistan. But reality is very different. Fundamental aspects of the war will continue for years to come. What has NATO accomplished over the past decade, and what is the future of this alliance? To CrossTalk whether NATO will walk the talk, I'm joined by Jeremy Corbyn in London. He is a British Labour Party politician and member of Parliament. In Washington, we have John Glazer. He is assistant editor at antiwar.com. And in Warsaw, we go to Eugeniusz Smolar. He is a senior fellow at the Polish Institute of International Affairs and a visiting senior fellow at the Center for European Studies. All right, gentlemen, CrossTalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want. John, if I can go to you first here. Mr. Barack Obama said in Chicago, NATO has been the bedrock of common security, freedom, and prosperity for nearly 65 years. It hasn't just endured, it has thrived because our nations are stronger when we stand together. 11 years after the occupation of Afghanistan, do those words ring true to you?
Well, we should ask if they ring true to an Afghan or to a Libyan or to a lot of people in the Balkans. The issue is that Obama sees NATO as securing Western influence and Western power and Western security. He's smart enough to know that NATO is not about progressing democracy or transporting freedom to the world and so forth. Afghanistan is a perfect example. NATO has laid waste to that country for a decade. Every aspect of the stated mission has failed. For virtually every 6-month period since Obama began his surge, violence and bloodshed has increased. So in terms of stability and security and freedom, I don't think that applies to the people that have been living under the boot of NATO for so long.
Okay, again, if I can go to you in Warsaw. What do you think about what John just said there? Because, you know, there was a lot of pomp and circumstance in Chicago, but really the alliance can't really claim any success whatsoever, particularly when we look at Afghanistan.
I was very patient. First of all, I must mention that this is not a military alliance. It is a political and military alliance, and this is a very clear distinction. 28 members willingly got together, agreed, and keep peace in Europe and Euro-Atlantic area. That's for one. And if you, John, in Washington, to my surprise, you say that NATO did not have success, just look at us. Look at the peace in Europe. Balkans, they don't kill each other, for Pete's sake. How can you say that? There are problems in Kosovo, there is instability in the area, but there is a peace in Europe, and NATO must do its utmost to keep it that way. There is no one else who will do that. When Afghanistan is concerned, this is an incredibly challenging situation, ethnically, religiously, or whatever. But the girls go to schools. You know, and the people died. They died as a result of the civil war which took place. Do you remember the name Taliban? We do remember. We lost our boys fighting them. I can't say it is a success. Maybe it will be a losing battle with the Taliban. I don't know, but we have to remember that Afghanistan is not about Afghanistan. It's about Pakistan with a nuclear weapon. It's about India and China challenging each other in the area. This is a key to the success of stability in the whole region. Okay. And of course, you might say,
Jeremy,
okay,
let me go to
home.
Jeremy in London. I guess that's cold comfort for the Afghans, what we just heard from Warsaw.
Well, it's very cold comfort, the Afghans. I get Afghan refugees arriving in my constituency who are desperate to get out of Afghanistan and try and survive. This is a defeat for NATO. They've spent billions of pounds, lost thousands of NATO troops' lives, and above all that, large numbers of Afghan people have died. The country is unstable, corrupt, and riddled with drug corruption and drug production. And this is a disaster for NATO, and I think the sooner the troops come out, the better, and the Afghan people are going to have to decide their own future in some way. Whatever happens next in Afghanistan, it's not going to be good. With the legacy of this, drone aircraft, instability in Pakistan, instability across the region, and large numbers of US bases all across the southern borders of Russia, it's not a good outcome to this whole operation.
You know, John, if I can go back to you in Washington, I was in Kabul 2 weeks ago, and it is an absolute catastrophe there. I mean, my goodness, the only thing you're only concerned with security, and nothing else happens there except for everyone wants to be safe. I mean, what kind of legacy is that going to be? Because we will withdraw, okay? And I'd like to point out to my viewers, the Taliban will be part of that process. They will be partly ruling the country, if not wholly ruling that country, after 11 years and after everything we've just heard on this program about this expenditure of treasury and of lives and loss of lives on the ground for Afghans.
Yeah, I mean, it was only a few months ago that the intelligence community released a report that said Afghanistan was still a stalemate and that the Taliban was robust, a robust insurgency. Even the Obama administration has been able to admit at certain times that the Taliban will be a part of any sort of political situation going forward. And the sort of deteriorating situation with Pakistan, which the Obama administration has absolutely ruined any sort of chance for a diplomatic, way forward. Pakistan has always preferred, especially elements of the ISI, has always preferred Taliban influence in Afghanistan as opposed to the U.S. puppet Karzai, especially because their primary enemy, India, is more likely to be able to wield some influence in Afghanistan with Karzai than with the Taliban. So they're perfectly willing to bolster the Taliban going forward in order to get rid of Indian influence. But I just want to point out, Pete, because it's funny that in 2012 here we can talk about NATO without referencing what it's all about, why we still have this organization. I mean, the stated purposes after the Second World War was to, protect against encroaching Soviet communism. But it's clear that that was not the case, and it's not the case now. I mean, Soviet communism is dead, and every U.S. administration since the fall of the Soviet Union has expanded NATO. So, of course, it couldn't be the case. There was a document in 1992 excuse me, just let me finish. There's a document in 1992 that circulated around the Defense Department. It became known as the Wolfowitz Doctrine, and it described what had been American policy going back to the Truman administration, which was that America's military and political mission in the post-Cold War era was to ensure that no military rival or superpower could emerge in Western Europe, in Asia, or in the territories of the former Soviet Union. And when you see it that way, you understand why this organization is still around and why it's so important to Washington's military hegemony across the globe.
Again, if I can go to you, why is NATO still around here? And you mentioned earlier that it's a political organization. Again, that's cold comfort for people that are bombed in Afghanistan and the Pakistani border, the people that were killed in Libya. I mean, that's cold comfort to say it's a political alliance. I mean, that's when you're at the other end of the stick. It's a pretty violent organization.
I must tell you,
and NATO has shown itself to be an amazingly violent military alliance with the end of the Cold War.
Oh, come on. I mean, this is ridiculous. Really, what John Glazer from Washington said, this is out of the Soviet textbook, and I really am surprised to hear that, that NATO was a source of instability, etc. Look at us. It reminds me of a joke from the old times. In Warsaw, in Washington, you can criticize President of the United States, and in Warsaw, you can do the same. This is not the way to approach the problem. It's not a question of aggression, it's a question sometimes of security. Do you remember what happened 9/11 in America? Where did it come from? I am not saying that there was no mismanagement.
It came from a global military presence for the U.S., which propped up military dictatorships.
Okay, so go home and stay there.
East.
You can vote. You can vote. We are not very happy in have to fight wars around, but we understand that nowadays the security is not being threatened here in the middle of let's say Western or Central Europe, but is being threatened elsewhere. And you don't want to do something about it. You can vote and change it.
Well, okay,
but the reality
let me jump in here, gentlemen. Let me go to Jeremy, because that's a very interesting point. Let's talk about democracy here. How democratic is it when 7 out of 10 of Americans are tired of this war in Afghanistan and want to get out now? But no, we hear from the President of the United States, we hear from the President of the United States is that we'll leave soon, but then, you know, on the other side, he says, but we're never going to leave because we'll be making sure American interests are protected in Afghanistan. You can't have it both ways, and the American people are against it.
But it's not about Afghanistan only.
No, I'm talking to Jeremy now in London. Go ahead.
No, when Obama made his Mile High Stadium speech to accept the Democrat nomination 4 years ago, he said he'd pull US troops out of Iraq in order to fight the real war in Afghanistan. And he's stayed in Afghanistan, and he's now being forced to withdraw from Afghanistan. Afghanistan has cost a lot and is a big defeat for NATO. But on the back of 9/11, and wherever was the logic of invading Afghanistan because of the horrors of 9/11, there's been this massive increase in US arms expenditure, huge increase and expansion of NATO, and from the Lisbon Treaty, a huge requirement on all NATO member states to spend a great deal on NATO-supplied arms. Yet, at the same time, the majority of NATO countries that are involved in Afghanistan have small numbers and are withdrawing. It's going to be Britain and the USA that's left there till the end.
I'm sorry, Jeremy, but it's not true. The military expenditure in Europe since 1989 went down dramatically, up to 25%. Your British expenditure is going to be cut about 8%. You know, this is not an increase of expenditure.
Go ahead, John, jump in before we go to the break. Go ahead, John, before we go to the break. Go ahead.
The United States accounts for about 75% of NATO's military budget. And the United States, me and my taxpayers, are the ones that are subsidizing European defense. So again, this is why European defense has been able to go down, but the American empire and the American national security state, which is not good for us or anybody else, has been going sky high.
This is wonderful. This is fantastic. Do you know what the budget of NATO is? Do you know what NATO budget is? NATO budget altogether is 3 billion.
All right, gentlemen, I'm going to jump in here. We're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on NATO's questionable future. Stay with RT. Again, if I can go back to you in Warsaw, what are the lessons learned from Afghanistan for NATO? Because it was asked before we went to the break, what is the purpose of the alliance now? Because we all know the history of it, okay? And we know the Cold War element. But what is its purpose now? I mean, it was for European, North Atlantic defense, okay? It has really gone way beyond that right now. And if we look at Afghanistan, even if the Taliban come back to power, which they probably will, that is not a threat to the United States of America. Maybe Poland is worried about it, but it's not a threat to the U.S.
No, we are not worried about the Taliban. We don't have any strategic or other interest in Afghanistan, Pakistan, etc. But we share the responsibility for the security of the world. And the United Kingdom and other allies have been doing it since the Second World War. The problem is that the Europeans are not doing their best. They cut the military spending. And this is a result of what Jeremy has told us, that the US is putting more into NATO than they did at the beginning. From 50% of the budget, it's now 75% is American money. So we have to do something about it. Secondly, it is a question of what NATO is about, and this question was put several years ago by Tony Blair, who said in the challenging circumstances we didn't decide yet how far NATO should go and do the right things. And this is a problem for politicians to decide, for the military people to decide, and to gain the democratic support.
I'm sorry, but to do the right thing, what does that mean, to do the right thing? American geopolitical interest is automatically a right thing? I mean, that's just no. That's what it sounds like.
You defined it in those terms. I didn't define it in those terms. It's a problem of security, of basic security. It's also a problem of nation building. It's a problem of North Africa at the moment. It's a problem of border security. It's a problem of control of civilians over the militaries in those countries. This is many problems. NATO is actually excellent.
Why is NATO? Why is it NATO has to fix all of these things? Why?
No, you can stay home and wait for the bomb to land in your backyard. Our history.
Or you can bomb people and they'll bomb you back. Go ahead, John.
No, you can help them in a, you concentrate on Afghanistan, but this is not a typical thing for NATO. NATO is doing many things, like, for example,
it's atypical
cyber
failure.
war, which is...
John, go ahead, jump in.
maybe he'll consider Libya more typical of NATO. What NATO did, and or the U.S. and sort of Britain and France did, was get permission from the UN Security Council to protect civilians with a no-fly zone, a mission which they almost immediately abandoned in favor of acting as an air force for the terrible rebel army and regime change against Gaddafi. This is what's more typical of NATO, pushing their will.
They are more terrible than the Gaddafi's forces. Thanks God for that, for good reasons.
Agree with, can I come in there?
Jeremy, Jeremy in London, jump in.
I have to agree with John on this point. NATO has given for itself a role of intervention in Afghanistan, intervention in NATO, intervention wheresoever it pleases. That was the whole Blairite agenda surrounding NATO. Now, in 1990, the Warsaw Pact gave itself up and collapsed. NATO should have done the same at that time. Instead, we have this massive global force. Has it made the world safer? Has it made the world more secure? Has it improved the civil liberties all over Europe and North America? You all know the answer to that question. We need to think very seriously about what this military alliance is actually for and why it is costing particularly US taxpayers, but others as well, such a vast amount of money and so many lives of young soldiers lost as a result of it.
And I just want to point out one more thing.
Go ahead, jump
in response to something he said, is that he says Europe should pick up more of the military slack for NATO. So a lot of Europe is in economic shambles right now, and that's a part of the problem of a welfare warfare state. When all of this money goes to the state to do with it what it wants, a lot of it's for war, and a lot of it's for social control, social constructions. This is the problem, and he wants more of it. Europe is, teetering on an economic ledge, and America's going that way as well, and he seems to want more of that. So I don't understand.
Evgeny, what do you think the future of the alliance is? If I can go back to Warsaw.
The future of the alliance is secured. The political alliance is strong. There are things which NATO needs to rethink as a result of Afghanistan, and maybe it will be the lessons learned that if people decide somewhere to kill each other, so Jeremy and John will sit in the backyard and wait for the things to happen. I'm not sure that the alliance will go for that. There is a problem of money, there's a problem of resources, there's a problem of political will, there's an economic crisis at the moment, but those things will pass. Those gentlemen somehow do not remember that
NATO
the alliance is a trading area of 800 million people who account for the half of the world GDP and the 2 trillion of investment in both ways. People sometimes, when they talk about China, forget that the US investment into Belgium last year was twice as big as into China. We have a strong alliance, and we want to make it stronger.
Well, okay, again,
the problem is when to apply.
The problem is in Chicago, most of the European partners of NATO walk away from their quote-unquote responsibility to Afghanistan. So I don't see the unity there. Jeremy, go ahead, jump in. You wanted to ask the question: what has NATO achieved?
Well, precisely, what has NATO achieved in Afghanistan? And also, since Libya keeps getting quoted as an example of NATO's humanitarian intervention, as John quite rightly said, they acted as an air force for the opposition. Never mind that the Western countries had all sold Gaddafi weapons up till 6 weeks before that bombing campaign begun, and that has then provoked a further civil war in Libya, the most appalling abuse of human rights of African people who happen to be living in Libya, and a lot of companies coming in to clean up the oil there. What was NATO really doing there? Was it about human rights and protecting lives, or was it really about oil and influence? And I just ask that question, and I think an awful lot of other people are asking that question. And whilst we're on the subject of expenditure, the point that has been made, the Western countries, particularly Western Europe, all of Europe for that matter, are going through problems of maintaining social welfare and health service systems. The public are not in a mood to spend more on defence when they see hospitals being closed.
Again, you show me one of the interesting things is, I was just going to say, when, for 10 years, 11 years now, most politicians in the West supported the occupation of Afghanistan in the name of democracy. But if you look in the streets of Chicago, and you look all across Europe and the United States, people are against this kind of spending on the military. Where's the democracy in that?
Well, first of all, they elect. I don't understand this approach. You elect your government, you have a Congress, you have Parliament. They make decisions on behalf of the people who vote. That's the basic of democracy. I know that in some countries decisions being made by one man or a clique of people who can decide about everything. But this is not the case of European democracies and the United States. I am not idealistic. We didn't go to Libya for some reasons, and if there would be more time, I could explain that. We didn't go, but it was not in NATO operation. It was a European operation supported by the United States, as Obama said, from behind. And NATO became a hub, organizational hub. It was not a NATO operation. It was, if you wish, a kind of coalition of the willing, and United Kingdom and France were in the forefront, if I can remind Jeremy. I understand that he would be against that. Maybe he will be against also defending Falkland Islands soon. It is the most fascinating debate because you cannot talk about NATO and its role also in Europe from the point of view of Afghanistan, to which you are coming back, because this is a very painful lesson learned, and I'm sure lessons will be learned. Now we have to do many things which are in securing the many parts of the world when you have conflict and people would kill each other, you know, if NATO would not intervene. There is a problem of piracy out of the Horn of Africa. This is against NATO operation. We have plenty of missions helping people to organize themselves. You come back to Afghanistan, okay, it's painful, but it will pass. And I'm looking for strong NATO in a strong democratic environment.
Okay, John, if I can go to you in Washington. Okay, Jeremy, you wanted to jump in there. I just don't see the political will.
Yeah, NATO requires.
Go ahead.
NATO requires of its members a particular level of defence expenditure, requires of itself cooperation, and under Chapter 7, anyone that attacks any or is perceived to attack any NATO member could therefore be invite everybody else in to defend them. So Syria could spread over into Turkey. Ipso facto, NATO is involved in the whole thing. I just think we need to think very carefully about the dangers of the whole NATO treaty, the levels of expenditure, and its willingness, its seeming to intervene where there are large quantities of oil or other vital minerals at stake. They seem more interested in the economic interests of the very powerful than they are in the humanitarian interests of the poorest people on this planet.
John, if I can go to you, do you think that NATO's on its last leg in light of Afghanistan? I know, you know, one member of our panel here wants to say it's an exception, but it's a really important example of what NATO does right or does wrong, and I would say wrong.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say because, you know, there's a lot of talk about some geopolitical shuffling going on in the next 5, 10, 20 years, and, you know, America might lose certain amounts of influence and this and that would in turn mean a loss of influence of NATO. But it's hard to actually tell. I mean, powers do terrible things and, you know, have 10-year blunders, and they go on much longer. I mean, America still spends approximately as much on its military as the rest of the world combined, and it still has a global military empire, 1,000 military bases in 130 or 40 countries. So the actual power differential is still very much there.
And this is against the will of those countries, of course.
Okay, jump in, Warsaw, go ahead.
No, as he quotes, it would be against the will of the countries concerned. You know, if NATO is not invited, does it invade the country to put its military base there? What rubbish is that?
Okay, Jeremy, I'll give you the last word on the program. Last thought.
It's time to think again about this vast level of military expenditure. The disaster and defeats of Iraq, Afghanistan, and the problems that remain in Libya mean that these military alliances don't bring about peace, justice, or human rights. They bring about an awful lot of profits for a lot of arms manufacturers.
Okay, on that depressing note, gentlemen, we've run out of time. Many thanks today to my guests in London, Washington, and in Warsaw, and thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time, and remember, CrossTalk rules.